public session at 7:07 p.m. And if we would stand and salute the flag in a moment of silence. I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Stay standing for a moment of silence.
Thank you. Please be seated.
I don't know. I'm looping.
Okay, recommend approving tonight's agenda as amended.
Second.
First, Mrs. Isler, second, Mr. Nichols, roll call vote. Mrs. Isler?
Approved.
Mr. Nichols?
Approved.
And Mrs. Pugh?
Approved.
So approved. Recommend the approval of the minutes of the Board of Education regular meeting of April 17, 2024.
So moved.
First, Mrs. Isler?
Second.
Second, Mrs. Pugh, roll call vote. Mrs. Isler?
Approved.
Mrs. Pugh?
Approved.
And Mr. Nichols?
Approved.
So approved. Recognition of guest. Hello, guest. Okay, communication from the board. Mrs. Pugh, we'll start with you.
I'm just going to say good evening. It's a beautiful night. We're all here and we're ready to roll, so good evening.
Okay, Mr. Nichols?
Yeah, I'm with that. I can't think of anything other than it's a nice night and it's cold in here. And I'm hoping to get warmed up.
It feels good now.
It feels good now, yeah.
Yeah,
It's much better.
it's okay,
Bobby.
Daryl.
Thanks,
Much
Bobby.
better.
You're good.
Looking out, Bobby.
Okay, Miss Isler?
You're cold too.
No, it feels good.
Isler, go ahead.
Good evening, everyone, and we've had a beautiful day today, and I'm so thankful there wasn't any rain. And I would like to say to all of our educators, a happy Teacher Appreciation Week. Yes. I want you to know that you are appreciated, as well as your support staff. Anyone who has a hand in educating our students, I call you educators, and I greatly appreciate the wonderful things that you're doing. Keep up the good work.
Very good. I agree with Sabrina, or Mrs. Isler. Also, want to give a huge shout out to our field and track for the first time in history.
Congrats. That's
We're Southern Division, and let's see, get ready for Friday night. We play Seaford baseball. We win that, we'll have Southern Division for that, but let's not speak ahead.
Been
Just
a
be
long
ready.
time since the boys did that too.
True. So, doing
I
good
think our middle
things.
school boys,
Yeah,
I
middle-
believe
yeah.
they
Are they?
Middle school baseball is playing, they'll be undefeated if they win today.
That's it.
Undefeated season.
Really?
Yes.
That's fine.
We need to have a parade for them.
Yes, we do. Absolutely. Susan, get on that.
That was so much fun. I was sitting waiting just to get the word for the field and track, and then I was sitting and waiting for softball, and I went, okay, well, I guess I'm not going to town, But they had a great
Still this-
season, plus they're still in the
still state tournament,
playoffs.
still state
Right,
tournament.
still in the playoffs.
But wait a minute, it ain't over yet, so let's don't.
It's not over till it's
Yeah,
over.
that fact.
All right, I have no one here that has signed up for public participation, so we'll move right along. Financial report.
It's been a long day, man. I'm telling you.
Good evening.
Good evening.
So, just a quick update from last month, just a couple weeks ago. We turned in the ESSER annual report and our Filter First report and our financial position report. And things we have coming up. This month, we're going to start working on the local funds, or actually, we'll wait to hear from the auditors for the local funds audit. But we're going to start working on our FY25 tax warrant and our FY25 preliminary budget. We'll also have the 12-month mass pay update that will be effective for July 1st. So we'll have that to start working on soon. And our FY24 year-end close coming up for June 30th. And there's our shot of our reserve and local fund compared to last year.
Looks like it's going up a little bit.
So remember I told you about
Yes.
that last week?
I saw it.
Last
Yeah,
month, so.
I saw it.
Okay, any questions for me?
No.
All right,
I don't
thank
have
you.
any.
Thank you, Mrs. Horsey. Yes.
Okay, unfinished business, none. New business, school choice, none. Fundraisers, recommend approving fundraiser as submitted.
So moved.
First, Mr. Nichols.
Second.
Second, Mrs. Pugh. Roll call vote, Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
Mrs. Pugh.
Approved.
And Mrs. Isler.
Approved.
So approved. Rentals, recommend approve request of Amy Handy, New Zion Methodist Church, to host the 20th Annual Bowling for God Basketball Tournament on Saturday, June the 1st, 2024, from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. at North Laurel Elementary School basketball courts. No cost to participants and certificate of liability insurance to be provided.
I recommend approval with use of facility fee waived, custodial fee waived, and constable fees waived.
Second.
Okay. Mrs. Isler recommended use of facility fee waived, custodial fee waived, and constable fee waived, with a second from Mrs. Pugh. Roll call vote, Mrs. Isler.
Approved.
Mrs. Pugh.
Approved.
And Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
So approved. Recommend approval of use of facility, wait a minute, where am I? Okay, recommend to approve request of Mattia Spicer, Art by Mattia, to host the Student Art Show, Showcase of Artwork, on Sunday, June 23rd, 2024, from 9 a.m. for setup. Event begins at 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. at North Laurel Elementary Learning Academy cafeteria. No cost to participate. Equipment request of microphone, 20 tables, and 80 chairs. Certificate of liability insurance to be provided.
Recommend approval with use of facility fee and custodial fees waived, constable fees apply.
Okay, Mrs. Isler is recommending
Second.
approval with the use of facility fee and custodial fee waived, but the constable fee applied. Second by Mr. Nichols. Roll call vote, Mrs. Isler.
Approved.
Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
And Mrs. Pugh.
Approved.
So approved. Professional trips, recommend approval of professional trips as a group.
So moved.
First by Mr. Nichols.
Second.
Second by Mrs. Isler. Roll call vote, Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
Mrs. Isler.
Approved.
And Mrs. Pugh.
Approved.
So approved. Recommend approval of professional trips as submitted.
So moved.
First, Mrs. Pugh.
Second.
Second, Mrs. Isler. Roll call vote, Mrs. Pugh.
Approved.
Mrs. Isler.
Approved.
And Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
So approved. The second reading of the 24-25 school calendar, recommend the second reading of the Laurel School District 2024-2025 school calendar as submitted and found on the district website and as found at the Laurel School District sites. The school calendar was available for review by the community at the Laurel School District buildings and on the district website.
So moved.
First by Mr. Nichols,
Second.
second by Mrs. Pugh. Roll call vote, Mr. Nichols,
Approved.
Mrs. Pugh,
Approved.
and Mrs. Isler.
Approved.
So approved. The 2024-2025 Laurel School District Board of Education meeting schedule,
So moved.
okay, as submitted. Mrs. Pugh,
Second.
second Mr. Nichols. Roll call vote, Mrs. Pugh,
Approved.
Mr. Nichols,
Approved.
and Mrs. Isler.
Approved.
So approved. Recommend to approve the 2024 Laurel School District summer hours schedule as submitted.
So moved.
First, Mrs. Pugh, second, Mrs. Isler. Roll call vote, Mrs. Pugh,
Approved.
Mrs. Isler,
Approved.
Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
So approved. No presentations for policy and resolution. Now, for possible action on executive session items, just bear with me. Be it resolved that the Laurel School District Board of Education approve the recommended personnel actions as identified on attachment A in executive session. Number 2, be it resolved that the Laurel School District Board of Education authorize that notice of termination of services at the end of the current school year be sent to affected professional employees who are on temporary contracts identified on attachment B in executive session. Number 3, be it resolved that the Laurel School District Board of Education approve notice of termination of services of support staff due to temporary employment be sent to affected employees identified on attachment C in executive session. Number 4, be it resolved that the Laurel School District Board of Education approve recommended personnel actions identified on attachment D in executive session. Number 5, be it resolved that the Laurel School District Board of Education approve recommended personnel actions identified on attachment E in executive session. Number 6, be it resolved that the Laurel School District Board of Education approve recommended personnel actions identified on attachment F in executive session. Number 7, be it resolved that the Laurel School District Board of Education approve recommended personnel actions identified on attachment G in executive session. Number 8, be it resolved that the Laurel School District Board of Education authorize that notice of intent to terminate services at the end of the current school year be sent to the affected professional employee due to neglect of duty to obtain standard teaching certificate identified on attachment H in executive session. Now, personnel, recommend to approve the personnel report with the recommendations as discussed in executive session as listed in attachment A.
So moved.
First, Mrs. Isler.
Second.
Second, Mrs. Pugh. Roll call vote, Mrs. Isler.
Approved.
Mrs. Pugh.
Approved.
And Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
So approved. Attachment B, teacher temporary contract non-renewal. Recommend to approve the personnel report with recommendations as discussed in executive session as listed in attachment B.
So moved.
Second.
First, Mrs. Isler, second, Mr. Nichols. Roll call vote, Mrs. Isler.
Approved.
Mr. Nichols. And Mrs. Pugh.
Approved.
So approved. Personnel attachment C, support staff temporary position non-renewals. Recommend to approve the personnel report with recommendations as discussed in executive session as listed in attachment C.
So moved.
First, Mrs. Pugh.
Second.
Second, Mrs. Isler. Roll call vote, Mrs. Pugh.
Approved.
Mrs. Isler.
Approved.
Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
So approved. Personnel attachment D, support staff. Recommend to approve the personnel report with recommendations as discussed in executive session as listed in attachment D.
So moved.
First, Mrs. Pugh. Second, Mr. Nichols. Roll call vote, Mrs. Pugh.
Approved.
Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
And Mrs. Isler.
Approved.
So approved. Personnel attachment E, cafeteria. Recommend to approve the personnel report with recommendations as discussed in executive session as listed in attachment E.
So moved.
First, Mr. Nichols.
Second.
Second, Mrs. Pugh. Roll call vote, Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
Mrs. Pugh.
Approved.
And Mrs. Isler.
Approved.
So approved. Personnel attachment F, teacher non-renewal. Recommend to approve the personnel report with recommendations as discussed in executive session as listed in attachment F.
So moved.
First, Mrs. Isler.
Second.
Second, Mrs. Pugh. Roll call vote, Mrs. Isler.
Approved.
Mrs. Pugh.
Approved.
Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
So approved. Personnel attachment G, support staff, non-renewal. Recommend to approve the personnel report with recommendations as discussed in executive session as listed in attachment G.
So moved.
First, Mrs. Pugh. Second, Mr. Nichols. Roll call vote, Mrs. Pugh.
Approved.
Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
And Mrs. Isler. So approved. Attachment H, professional neglect of duty to obtain standard teaching certificate. Recommend to approve the personnel report with recommendations as discussed in executive session as listed in attachment H.
So moved.
First, Mrs. Isler.
Second.
Second, Mr. Nichols. Roll call vote, Mrs. Isler.
Approved.
Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
And Mrs. Pugh.
Approved.
So approved. Okay, future agenda items. The next regular board meeting has been moved to Wednesday, June 12th at 7 p.m. at the Laurel Middle High School cafeteria, beginning at 7 p.m. And then following that, Board of Education reorganization meeting scheduled for Wednesday, June 12th at approximately 7:30 I see a.m. No, I don't think so. 7:30 p.m. minus, give or take a little bit on that, right here at the Laurel Middle High School cafeteria. This is when the reorganization, be swearing in our new board member, Kim Ralph. That will be here, and so that takes place that night.
That's June 12th.
June 12th, yes. June 12th, you got that?
Yeah.
Okay, because we're supposed to meet June 19th, but it's
Juneteenth.
Juneteenth. You'll be off. I'll be working, so think about it. Okay, motion to adjourn.
So moved.
First, Mr. Nichols, second, Mrs. Isler. Roll call vote, Mr. Nichols,
Approved.
Mrs. Isler,
Approved.
and Mrs. Pugh.
Approved.
We're adjourning at 7:21 p.m.
And the middle school baseball team just concluded an undefeated season.
It's over.
Hey,
They won.
what was the score?